Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. This is our 190th show, uh, which I think is something to celebrate. Um, it seems to us on the show, it's quite an achievement to having covered as many different interviewees and guests as we have over such a protracted period of time and still be sane and functioning. And it's all thanks to you, our audience. You're the people out there who do the sort of heavy lifting, giving up your evenings at 7 o'clock and watching and listening to us. We're very grateful to you. And to all of you who've supported the crowdfunder, many thanks. For those of you who are still thinking about supporting the crowdfunder, please do. Please do it now. Because unlike the BBC, we are not sitting on a war chest of £300 million a year being spent by people based elsewhere. We, in fact, have to work hard, graft hard for an income in order to produce shows like this and many others. So whatever you can do, reach into your pocket, find a few pennies or a few pounds ideally, and send it to the crowdfunder. You'll see the details on the screen right now. And I, for one, would be terribly grateful. Much appreciated. Well, as we say each week, this has been a great day for British democracy. Let me just cover a few of the highlights for you. And if you spot the odd contradiction in there, well, that's the way things are done in the UK. For example, Keir Starmer has invoked the spirit of Thatcher as he goes for growth. Now, he has an option, of course. He can always obtain growth almost right away by asking to return to the EU. They'd be more than happy to have him, I'm sure, with the spectre of President Trump on the horizon, rampaging around the world, adding tariffs here, there, and everywhere. So the bigger group you're in, the better. Where you don't want to be is isolated on the fringes of a major trading bloc like the EU. You really want to be part of it. But anyway, faced with that choice, Keir Starmer has decided to beat up on the poor, which is another way of talking about austerity. He wants to cut in order to get growth. Think about that. He wants to reduce things in order to grow. I don't know. I mean, has he ever met an economist? I wonder. Would he know what an economist looks like? I mean, you do ask yourself. But then again, he's advised. He has a Chancellor of the Exchequer whose job it is to look after all these things. And she's a startling individual herself. She has said, for example, today, in applauding the idea of a third runway, an idea that has been raised and disposed of with about 5 of the last successive governments in Westminster. And it was each and every time they get into government, the lobbyists descend upon them and say, we need a third runway at Heathrow. Each and every time they say, what a jolly good idea. Each and every time the opposition and others say, but we looked at that and it's a crap idea. Why don't we extend the runways elsewhere? Sticking a proper runway at Dundee for international traffic, for example. That's just one. I can think of many other examples. But no, it's a third runway at Heathrow, despite all the huge environmental arguments against it. But her argument for her, listen to this, as a sop to the feeble Scottish Labour MPs, I suspect, after much lobbying, she says, it's hard not to laugh. She says, this will aid the export of Scottish whisky. So the idea is that you don't ship Scottish whisky from anywhere else. You have to ship it to London, and then you ship it on this third runway to your customers overseas. Now, I know it's difficult to find good staff nowadays, and I sympathise with her. But somebody somewhere should have checked, and somebody somewhere should have gone to the website that's listed as whiskeyadvocate.com, and there they would have found that the vast majority of whisky exports are shipped in bulk via seaborne containers. In other words, they don't go anywhere near any airport. Not one. Nada. I mean, what are we paying people for? I mean, this is not rocket science. All you do is go onto Google and say, is there the slightest problem with what I'm recommending the minister to say? The fact that she doesn't have a brain cell or two to put together in order to, in fact, just for a second, query what she's thinking about and saying is an interesting point in itself. But let me tell you what the outcome of all of this lousy government is. The latest voting intentions from Westminster are, now I hope you're holding on to something substantial right now, Labour 25%, Reform 25%, Tory 25%. Now, this is an electoral system which is predicated on first past the post. There's no proportionality here, or even an attempt at proportionality. What you see is what you get. The winner takes all. And that 75% of the votes are split between these three. It's what the Americans call a crapshoot. Anything could happen. What a way to run a country. I mean, if it was a series, it would be a joke. So there we are. Let's put this great element of British democracy to one side and talk about ideas for the future that actually make much more sense. So we're delighted tonight to have Ian Grant with us. And Ian will be talking about, in particular, about many things, about his convention, spring convention coming up on the 1st of March at Greyfriars Charterist Centre in the Pleasance in Edinburgh. And he'll be talking about what that is for, why it's taking place, and why you should be interested in it. Ian, welcome. How are you?
Hello there, John. I'm very well, thank you.
And where are you speaking to us from tonight?
Home in South Queensferry.
South Queensferry, heavens above. How were you affected by these terrible tornadoes and winds and shocking conditions?
Well, personally, we were not very much affected, although I was out in the garden today raking up some branches and twigs and so on that had come off trees, but luckily the trees themselves were unscathed.
That's amazing.
Unscathed.
I saw pictures of the Forth Road Bridge shaking in the winds and stuff. It was doing what it's designed to do. It was adapting to the conditions.
I think the car still managed to go across the new, much maligned Queensferry crossing. It was not closed during the storm, so all credit to that.
Well, if it's still functioning to that degree, it shouldn't be maligned. I wonder who the maligners are. I wonder who the malignants are.
Yeah, I think the local Lib Dem MP who has several nicknames.
Well, let's leave the absurd to one side and talk about your conference, the convention. Why are you doing it, and what's it for?
Well, it's actually the first, we hope, of a series of meetings or conventions, whatever you like to call them, about Scotland's future.
Yeah.
Now, from what you've been talking about in the global affairs and what's happening in the world with Trump and what's happening in the United Kingdom, you'd think, gosh, why are we having a long discussion about Scotland's future? Why can't we just get out of there immediately? But my feeling and the feeling of the people in our group, the Independence Forum, is that when independence comes, it may well not be an agreeable time. It may not be consensual, and we've got to be ready. We've got to be prepared. We've got to have plans, and we've also got to have experts lined up so that we can go immediately. I think one of the issues with there are some folk that feel that all we should campaign about is independence. But I think we've got to not just put the case for independence, we've got to say how we achieve it. And I think we've got to give confidence to the voters that we on the yes side know what we're doing, that we have plans, we've got experts, and we can get up and running.
Yeah.
And that's what we're really about.
And you're locating it on 3 different sectors. You're talking about Scotland's future land, Scotland's energy future, and Scotland's democratic future. Why have you divided it in these 3 elements?
Well, yeah, looking at the prospectus, I mean, one of the objectives, as well as having the conventions of one of the objectives of the Independence Forum, was to have a prospectus generally for Scotland's future, and that is a combination. Really, it's demonstrating the opportunities of independence, and I think energy comes under that category because Scotland, with its renewables, has got fantastic opportunities.
Yeah.
And it's also combating the obstacles, and the obstacles, or the perceived obstacles, how will we manage our pensions? How will we manage our currency, etc.? And of course, the Scottish Currency Group, which is up and running and has been for some time, has addressed that issue. And so what we sat down and we thought, we want perhaps a combination of opportunities and obstacles to deal with. And we thought for the first one, we'd take a number of really fairly pivotal subjects, which nobody could deny are important for the future of Scotland. It's a great resource of land, which is largely not in our own hands. Energy, which, as I've said, has got fantastic potential, although at the same time, our poor people are freezing without our winter fuel payments, and with the highest electricity prices in Europe, but has got fantastic opportunities for the country. And then lastly, of course, the democracy. I mean, the democracy of Britain is a joke at the moment. You've already alluded to the voting system and the fact that we really have no idea who's going to come out and talk, no matter how we vote, and the House of Lords, etc. So that the democratic future of Scotland and independent Scotland has to be completely different, and that's why we've chosen these 3 subjects. I would say that in subsequent conventions, and we aim to have one in the summer and in the autumn, those who attend this one on the 1st of March will have a chance to choose what they consider the important issues for discussing for the summer and the autumn.
Good. Now, what's interesting for me is that, and here's a question. Have you had any contact with the Scottish Government? Are they supportive of what you're doing? Are they neutral on it? Or are they anti the whole idea of having a convention like this?
I have to confess that we've not spoken to the Scottish Government. I know that many others have in the independence movement and have had varying degrees of response from them, but we haven't spoken to them. We haven't really spoken to very many politicians, and you can argue about that, but our feeling was that we wanted to get, first of all, the Independence Forum up and running, and then the convention up and running. And we wanted to do that without conflict. We wanted to do it with the members of the movement getting together and working it out. We didn't want politicians grandstanding. We didn't want politicians fighting with each other or wanting not to share platforms as occurred between some of the parties. And so we've actually decided to start in that way. And one would hope that if it's successful, I mean, I think the first one is very much on trial. As we move to the second and third one, we'd hope if we have success that the politicians will be emailing us and phoning us and saying, can we come along? And we will see.
Yes, you will see. I can tell you what our experience has been, and it's not entirely positive, I have to say. He's searching for a euphemism. We spoke to the Constitution Secretary, so-called, and he said, it's not something I want to talk about, i.e. the Constitution. And he's demonstrated by his actions and behaviour that's exactly the case. He doesn't talk about the Constitution unless he can avoid it, and even then it's tangential and it's marginal, where he's defending a decision not to have any financing for dealing with independence in the budget. And the second thing is, when we asked the leader of the SNP group at Westminster, a man I admire immensely, when the Constitutional Convention, as agreed by the Scottish Government and the SNP, would actually take place and who would be in charge of it. Well, that was 6 months ago and we're still waiting to hear back. And I phoned his office 4 times and never got the courtesy of a response. So it strikes us that there's no real sense of wishing to engage necessarily. I think there's a high comfort level with the present arrangements, which makes your initiative even more essential, it seems to me, because you're filling a gap that many people might argue ought not to be there, because there ought to be a whole bunch of civil servants beavering away. There should be a whole bunch of other folks doing exactly what you're doing in order to prepare. Because if it's the case that we have an SNP government, and they can come on the show, by the way, and tell us I'm wrong, I'm very happy for them to do so. But to all appearances, it would look as if there's no activity taking place in the very area that you feel is important. And I agree with you. I think it's terribly important. But I'm saying to myself, how come it's Ian Grant who's doing this? Why isn't it the Constitution Secretary? Where's all that effort going?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, who should, one of the things that struck me in 2014 when I read the voluminous volume, which I think was called Scotland's Future, was it not?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Was that it was written by civil servants. And it always struck me that at the end of the day, the people that should write the prospectus for Scotland's future should be those people who are the advocates for it, rather than the civil servants. Civil servants should perhaps tweak it here and there and take out the fanciful bits and make it a bit realistic. But I think it's very important that the activists and the experts amongst the activists and the supporters do the writing of the prospectus. And so I think the other issue we've been attacked for in some areas, people think this is too long term. But if we had done this in 2014, we would have been a very much better position today than we are now. Where we've basically had minimal amount of work and preparation for the future of Scotland. And so I think that it is worth starting up on a long-term plan, which is what we're doing. But equally, we will have to look at, or others will have to look at the short term as well. How do we handle 2026 election, for example? How we get to independence in terms of what route, how we get there.
Okay.
But we are not primarily looking at that. We're making an assumption that we're going to get to independence, and that this prospectus and this discussion and the work of the convention will persuade people to think about voting in favour of independence, but equally it will prepare the country for when independence comes.
Interesting. Let me give you a question from our audience. Charles Smith is asking, is this likely to evolve into or even be the equivalent of a convention of the states?
I think that's interesting. You know, one of the things that we keep getting hit by is that it gets called a constitutional convention, and this is at the present time not a constitutional convention. It may partly evolve into a constitutional convention, but at the present time it is um, something. It is something we have considered. We thought if we carry on with this group and if it grows, and if we cover all the subjects, it is possible that this could evolve into a sort of, if you like, a second chamber,
Yeah.
or which, if you go in historical times, a convention of the estates. And indeed, of course, one of the discussion topics within the third, the democracy section of the day, does consider the second chamber, and not as a sort of revising chamber, but as a chamber which, if you like, keeps an eye on the first chamber and keeps an eye that the constitution is being stuck to, and that nobody is doing anything silly or, you know. So I would say yes. I think that is a long-term hope, perhaps, that it might go in that direction, but it may well not. And I'm easy about it. We go along and we see how it evolves.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting. Oh, by the way, somebody's asking me to define the term tangential. It means not in the centre, i.e., on the periphery. It's not something that carries any great weight, but something that might be dealt with at some future date, yet to be determined. So tangential, marginal, whatever term you prefer. But the interesting thing is here, it seems to me that it would be difficult for an SNP group or a group of people committed to independence necessarily to attract people from churches and trade unions, etc., which is a point that some of our audience are making today. That would have to come from some entity that wasn't seen to be having a commitment to any particular outcome. Softly, softly catch a monkey, as they say.
Yeah, we have been perhaps not as careful as we should have been. I mean, because actually we are the Independence Forum, and we've set up the convention. The idea is the convention, when set up, will have a separate management, a separate website, and should be independent from the forum. And we've called it the Spring Convention on Scotland's Future, deliberately, because we wanted to leave it open. And the questions we've asked in the various sections don't just deal with an independent Scotland. The land section, for example, can operate within devolved Scotland, although I think there are some issues there. For example, if we decided to tax the landowners out of the country, I've no doubt that they would be resorting to the law courts, for example. And if we were a sovereign state, it would be slightly more protected than a devolved state. So, but still, but some of these subjects, relate to devolution. And when we've dealt with energy, we're looking at the situation at the present time. We're looking at the situation perhaps in 5 years' time. What could we do in the short term before independence occurs?
Well, let me task you on that, if I may. Where do you see Scotland being in 5 years' time?
Where do I? Well, I suspect it won't have moved terribly far in 5 years' time, but we've got to change that, and we've got to, I've got. I'm not a great predictor of these things, but the only thing that can influence electorally the country within the next 5 years is the 2026 election. And I think it will probably be an ambiguous result. In other words, it'll be still a 50-50 split. We've got to sort of shift that. Mind you, yeah, we've got to shift opinion. But in fact, Labour's doing a fairly good job at helping us. That's one thing for certain. But I think that in 5 years' time, we will have a lot of more people with expertise in the key areas who will have joined the campaign, and who will have papers and expertise in currency, in energy, in land, on the constitution, although there's a fair amount of activity there already, but and some of the others.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm going to challenge you a bit here now. Some people watching and listening tonight will say, hey, guys, we like you a lot. We love what you're telling us. But the reality is the way you win elections is the way Trump won his election and the way the Labour Party won their election. You come up on the stump, you tell a pack of lies, which you've absolutely no intention of meeting, promises you have no intention of reaching and fulfilling. And then you get elected. Now, as soon as you're elected, you turn around and say, oh, the other guy left a real mess, and therefore I'm not going to do any of the things I promised you. And furthermore, I'm going to do less of the things that you're presently getting. What would you say to that? Why campaign? Why bother? Just tell lies.
Well, there's no doubt that, well, we don't quite yet know if Trump has totally lied, but certainly with the Labour Party since the election last year, it is mind-boggling the number of lies they have told on all manner of subjects, and they've got, well, they haven't got away with it. They've been absolutely mauled in the polls. But I suppose the best comparison is with Brexit, and you know the Brexiteers lied totally through their teeth about coming out of the EU. I think it's a very different thing campaigning for an English audience and a Scottish audience. I think Scotland, unfortunately, has had 300 years of being effectively ruled, and there's a lack of confidence. And I think the 2014 referendum was lost due to lack of confidence in the yes campaigners, that the feeling that they were perhaps unable to deliver a successful independent country. And
but why was that, do you think?
Why was it? I think that the Scots are not going to be persuaded by a glib message on the side of a bus. And whereas I think with England, well, take a football analogy, they really think they're going to win the World Cup every single time. And the fact that they don't hasn't quite dawned on them yet. I think Scotland does not have that confidence. And so I think it's very important that one works.
Let me tell you what I think was wrong with the 2014. This is not a popular view, but I'm sticking with it. It was far too positive. In other words, I met with the guy who was running the campaign, and I said to him, you remind me of a one-club golfer. You dispense every day, unremittingly, hope. The other guy has a number of weapons, but his main weapon is, if I can mix metaphors now with clubs, is fear. You need a bit of fear in your message to make it viable. In other words, it has to, you need more than one club, and you have to have something which says, look, if you go down the route that he's suggesting, these are the horrible things that are going to happen to you. There was none of that. Absolutely none of it. It was unremittingly hopeful. Now, I applaud that on one level because that's the way I feel about it. But that's an emotional, that's an intellectual response. The best emotional arguments are generally negative. Hope is always overcome by fear when it comes to advertising. I can sell more tubes of toothpaste by telling you that your teeth are about to fall out than I can by saying, if you use this, your teeth will look better.
Yeah.
I have to reach out to you to make you fearful. On the back of that, I can sell you something. If I came at you with a message unremittingly hopeful, then you wouldn't buy my product at all. And I thought that was a big mistake. Not to have one lever at least that you could reach out to people and say, there's going to be hell to pay. That happened after the event. I mean, I spoke to one or two people who said, eloquently put that case, including playwrights and poets and others. And the reality is they got no traction whatsoever within the campaign. Absolutely none.
No,
If you weren't hopeful, you weren't in the room.
I agree with that. There's no doubt that we could have used fear to a far greater extent than we did.
Yeah.
And in fact, it was quite visible on the doorsteps in 2015 when I was canvassing the number of people that apologised to me for voting no in the referendum, and that they would now vote yes, and they would vote yes at SNP, and that would make up for it. I think it was as you say, a one club campaign, which was not clever. But if you take the situation now, I mean, certainly a lot of the fears have come to pass, leaving Europe, all the recent stuff with since the Labour Party came in, the loss of the 2-child cap maintained, the loss of the winter fuel allowance, all the stuff that we've had in the last 24 hours, this afternoon, with concentration of investment in the south of England. That's all, and oh gosh, I mean, there's too many things to mention, really. Grangemouth, for example, and the closure of Grangemouth. But that's not our job. I think I think there are other people that must campaign and must employ more than one club, and must point out the positivities, and also must draw, to people's attention.
I think. I mean, I'm not sure. There's an argument about whether a referendum is necessary or not, and we can come to that later, perhaps, if we've got time. But the reality is that if it were to be a referendum, it would have to be conducted on a very, very different basis. In other words, the reason that Better Together chose the caption they did, the slogan they did, because they did the research. Yes. And they did enormous research, probably paid for by you and I in part, through the government, which clearly indicated to them that you have to go with Project Fear. You have to make people fearful, and you have to invent, if necessary, reasons to be fearful. And you have to threaten people's pensions. You have to threaten their health. But they were all threats. It was odious. But there was no countervailing threat. There was no, if we're independent, the last thing you want is an unruly neighbour. There was none of that stuff. I mean, it was just woeful the way it was done. Sorry, but I need to ask you a quick question before we go any further, and it's this. A question has been asked. Are IFS inviting those from outside the independence movement to attend?
We have invited folk from out with the independence movement. We wrote to civic societies, we wrote to churches, we've been in touch with the trade unions, and the trade unions, in principle, are in favour of coming and joining us. Whether we'll get them for this particular convention is doubtful. We're still awaiting reply, but we've had a pretty poor response, and this is reflection of the sort of society we've got at the moment in Scotland, that 50% of the population are in favour of independence, 50% against, and yet all the media, and it's not just the media. I mean, if you are working in universities or in the health service, or probably in big companies as well, there's a strong persuasion really for you not to discuss the future and the constitutional future of Scotland. We've got almost a silence debate, and I think it's quite difficult to break this. But interestingly, in Ireland, where there's an organisation called Ireland's Future, which has had meetings the length and breadth of the country, north and south, in fact, the Unionists did not take part initially. This was purely a nationalist enterprise. But as time has gone on, people have been invited to take part, and they have taken part. And there is a discussion that has widened. And what we're hoping is that once we've had a number of meetings with reasonable balance in our discussions, that they will come on board. But can I just go back to the business of the negative campaigning? That's not our job. What we're trying to do with the convention, with the Forum Convention, is basically to look at the future of Scotland.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And, so that when
I wasn't suggesting it for a second that you ought to be running negative campaigning.
I think it is important that it's a two-prong or a multi-prong approach, whereby there are some people who are indulging in campaigning, for example, in 2026, who will use negative campaigning, I hope, and will point out the flaws of the union.
I'm not sure. It's hard not to get the feeling sometimes that the Scottish Government is hedging its bets. In other words, I think Leslie Ruark put it this way, and my apologies, Leslie, if this is not attributable to you, that the Scottish Government is a little cage, and they're very happy to be in that cage. In other words, they like it, they're comfortable with it, everyone makes a decent living, and from time to time they shout from the cage, independence. But there's a large degree of comfort in the cage. The only way you're going to get independence, I suspect, is to rattle the bars. You're not going to get it by being acquiescent and saying, well, I wish it was a different cage, but I'll tell you what, I'm going to be busy putting up curtains in this cage. I'll put a little cupboard over here in the cage. I'll maybe try and get some extra tidbits here and there. But we're all going to still live in this cage. And I think maybe that is at the root of why the support for independence stays roughly half and half. There's a suspicion that if one was unequivocal and saying, this is a cage, but we accept it's a cage and we want to be rid of it. And these are the plans that we have to get rid of it. Not, for example, in order to get a budget through, we're prepared to concede we're not going to spend any money on independence. Seems to me that's entirely the wrong way to go. It gives a very bad message to people like you who want to see a significant constitutional change. In fact, it rather undermines what you're doing, I would suggest.
Well, I think that's true, really. There's no doubt that when Brexit actually happened, I think, was it January 2020 or thereabouts, and Nicola Sturgeon made her speech, it was almost, it felt like a sort of capitulation, really. And thereafter, they went through the routine of announcing another referendum date, which wasn't fulfilled. And you do get the feeling that they're, I have a certain sympathy for John Swinney in terms of he had to stabilise the ship. But nevertheless, I get the feeling that there isn't independence has taken a back seat, really, and there don't seem to be plans. And I certainly wouldn't have climbed down to the Lib Dems in terms of withdrawing spending on independence, even though I didn't think the papers that were produced were terribly persuasive. But there we are.
But you wouldn't have done that, but they did.
I wouldn't have done that.
No, and you wouldn't have done it for very good and I think compelling reasons. So you have to ask yourself, what compelling reasons did they have to take exactly the opposite approach, which is to kowtow to the established order in order to get a budget through? I mean, you see, it's here what it's saying, guys, and I think the budget is important. In fact, I go further. The budget is terribly important. But is it more important than the necessary constitutional change? Have you looked out the cage bars to see what's happening out there? Have you looked at the biggest quango in the country, the House of Lords, being augmented by even more deadheads and ne'er-do-wells? It's extraordinary. Not to say, look, I find this whole business of the House of Lords and the way it's constructed reprehensible. And to be very clear, not to kowtow, not to say, oh, this is just a nice ceremonial thing. It's not. These people make laws, for crying out loud. It's unacceptable in democracy for a bloated bunch of people there by the appointment of various politicians to make laws. And not only to make laws, but even worse, they cannot be removed.
Yeah, I know.
What sort of democracy is this? For example, if you and I were to sit down right now, here's a test. If you were to sit down, you and I would sit down here right now and say to the good folks watching and listening, we've come up with this great scheme whereby I and John Drummond will make laws forever. And we're not going to put ourselves up for election. Isn't that a great idea? Well, I can tell you what most of the people would say. They would say, Ian, John, you guys want to go off and get a cold shower and sort yourselves out, because what you're describing is not democracy, something else, but it ain't democracy. And yet here we are, intent to shamble along with this utter mess.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the problem is that the SNP politicians basically just refuse to understand, or perhaps they do understand, but do not want to know that getting independence means having a conflict, basically, that you're going to have to fight for it, not physically, but metaphorically, you're certainly going to have to fight for it. And I mean, the idea that they're going to be able to have a nice, pleasant chat and a nice, pleasant negotiation and get it is going to be non-consensual. And again, when we become independent, it is going to be a bit of a mess, really. There's going to be a changeover, which is not going to be, it's probably, in the end of the day, quite sudden. And that's why the convention is so important. And the whole process of planning Scotland's future is important, because we've got to have the plans in place. And that is what we are doing. And
isn't there a lot? I'm not saying you do this, but I'm suggesting the Scottish government does it, or certainly the SNP does it, is to say, look, the present arrangements are completely unacceptable.
Yeah.
It's completely unacceptable that we've got an unelected group of people making laws, and where these people cannot be removed. They're not elected, they're appointed, right? And they make laws. Yeah. And a whole bunch of them are there because they belong to a particular group of faiths. The only other place that happens is Iran, where clerics make laws. Yeah. The whole thing, it seems to me, is utterly and totally indefensible. And I can't understand for the life of me why somebody in the SNP and somebody in the Scottish government doesn't say, look, you can describe it as negative campaigning starting early. This is unacceptable. This is a democratic affront. And no civilized people should have to put up with it. I mean, what's to be lost? The SNP doesn't send people to the House of Lords. What have they got to lose?
But sadly, we sent 56 MPs down to Westminster in 2015, and they sat and behaved themselves like good little boys and girls on the green benches. And it is amazing in retrospect that they didn't make any impact whatsoever, because none of them were prepared to do what you're suggesting, which is to take issue with the Westminster regime.
Well, I'm reading Rory Stewart's book just now. Remember Rory the Tory, who was a government minister and now has his own podcast with Alistair Campbell. There's a little plug that went unsolicited. In his book, he's trenchant. He's quite clear about the inadequacies, the gross inadequacies, leaving the House of Lords aside, the actual misfunctioning of the British state. He displays in all of its awfulness in his book. He doesn't have a good word to say about most of the civil service. He doesn't have a good word to say about the whips and all the rest of that paraphernalia. And he was a good little boy. He sat on the back benches and supported his Cumbrian farmers and shepherds and stuff like that, like a good constituency MP. But the reality is, what he describes is frankly, shocking.
And the same is probably true within the Scottish Government, because we're served by the UK civil service, and who are probably taking their orders from elsewhere. It's endemic, really.
Well, it's only endemic because of the system. The system is screwed up, and I can't understand why we don't say that. The impression that people get, I suspect, is Westminster runs reasonably well. It could run better, but it's okay, pretty much. It isn't. It's a mess. These are not my words. These are Rory Stewart's words. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but he doesn't describe some sort of fantastic bureaucracy serving the public 24 hours 7. It's not like that. It's a mess. It's a shambles. It goes from one crisis to the next. It's built in. Ministers only stay in post for about 9 months to a year, and that enables the civil service to run things the way they want to run it. Now, if the civil service was full of bright, able, gifted people, that would be one thing, and many of them are. But, for example, Rory Stewart, I believe, is an old Etonian. Even he was shocked when he went into David Cameron, who was then Prime Minister, into his office. He discovered every single person in the office was an old Etonian.
Yeah.
It's incestuous. And we should be, in my humble opinion, somebody in the Scottish Government should be pointing these things out and saying, look, this is what we want to get rid of. This is a mess. This is not just guys getting by. These are guys floundering, they're drowning, and it's a mess, and it has to get fixed. It can only be fixed constitutionally, so let's talk about the ways to fix it constitutionally, the way you're doing.
Yeah. Well, I think this is, if the politics, how do you sort this out? And you may well be aware that there have been a number of conversations in recent weeks. The group that, if you like, your opposition, the Prism group on the Sunday, who have their discussion on a Sunday, and there's also another group with some well-known figures in it, and Jim Sillars is also having conversations, and we are looking at a restructuring of the movement. But the question really is how you go about, if you like, dislodging the current caution of the SNP and replacing it with something a bit more vigorous and effective. And we're at the very, very early stages of doing that.
Well, I think maybe one of the things that inhibits the Scottish Government is a sense that they are gun shy when it comes to the media. I mean, and there are good reasons for feeling that way. It's a quite legitimate emotion. In other words, they're terrified that somebody in BBC Scotland is going to give them a hard time. That's the wrong way to deal with it. If you've got a bully in the class, the way not to deal with a bully is to defer.
Yeah.
The way you deal with a bully is to take a bully head on. And there's lots of things that the Scottish Government could do. They could, for example, dare I say it, support Independence Live. They could support other groups if they want them to be completely neutral but all embracing, then fine. There's loads of ways they could do that. Masses of ways. The government advertises all the time, right? And it could inject advertising into different channels. They will say, but broadcasting is reserved. You're not broadcasting. You're using the internet. The
Yes.
internet is open. Heavens
Yes.
above, it's far too open. We've got Twitter or X. We've got everybody can say almost anything they like and do anything they like, to anyone they like. So how come the Scottish government is inhibited about making its case for independence and allowing a bunch of bureaucrats, effectively based in London, to decide what is broadcast into their country? It's outrageous.
Well, it's very difficult to work out what it is that is inhibiting the SNP, whether it's just being comfortable or whether it's because the civil service in Scotland is blocking what they want to do. But it's very difficult to work that out. But somehow or other, the movement has got to take it over.
Well, I'll tell you what's going to happen, and I'm not any sort of wonderful forecaster here, but the same thing happened many years ago, and there was something called the 79 Group, and it was supported by Alex Salmond, and that changed the whole party.
Yeah.
Did the party want to be changed? No, it didn't. But the time had come because too many people were too comfortable, and that you don't get votes by being comfortable. You just don't.
No.
And if people are they're induced because to vote for you, and the reason that they're defecting from the Labour Party is evocative. They're deserting the Labour Party not because of any clever things the SNP is doing, frankly, is because people have lost confidence. They've said, these guys promised me something, I only half believed them, and now I wish I hadn't even half believed them.
Yeah.
So, and I'm never going to believe them again. This is the crucial issue. I am never going to believe them again. And when you've got that situation, you're in a win-win environment. You can't lose now by going for the jugular, because the only major opposition you have effectively has strangled itself at birth.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know why it did that, but I can suspect why it did it. But it's done it, and that's a fact. And you're left with a completely different environment in which to operate.
Yeah.
And so the work that you're doing seems to me is hugely supportive of showing people clearly this is the alternative. This is the mess. And we're going to spend some time talking about the mess. And over here, thanks to Ian and others, here's the future.
Yes.
So you need the two things.
I would agree with that. I think, as I say, we've never pretended to be both sides of the two prongs of the attack. We are the folk that are hoping to map out the future and hoping to make, so that when we do get our independence, that we are in a fit state to run the country, but also to demonstrate that actually we have the experts, the plans to make a successful country. Meanwhile, of course, you have to have a fully financed either independence movement, independence party, which is actually vigorously campaigning for independence. And as you say, it's got to be negative as well as positive, and it's got to have a plan. At the moment, you've got no idea. I've got no idea what the SNP's plan for independence is. As you say, I suspect they're just hoping that it might come along one day. And
well, there's something to be said for that argument. I mean, when you watch your main opposition party not only shooting itself in the foot, but trying to shoot itself in its forehead as well, it's easy to be complacent and to say, and they're probably right if they're thinking this, under its present leadership, the Labour Party is doomed, utterly and completely doomed in Scotland, without the SNP lifting a finger.
Yeah.
Now, they will resist that argument, but that's the reality. But I'm pretty sure. I'm hoping to run some opinion polls soon, and I think it will endorse that view. It will say, we don't know much about what the SNP is planning right now, but it's a reasonably competent government, and it's produced some real dividends. So let's posit that, first of all, let's damn what we have at present, because we haven't done that yet. We have to damn it fully. and make people fully aware of the utter awfulness of the present system, because that is kept from them because of the way the mass media operates.
Yeah.
But you say, okay, then we'll set up alternative ways of communicating this disastrous state of affairs, and not to be complacent and rely upon the existing channels, because they just don't work.
I think we have to do it pretty quickly because, if you look back at history in Ireland, the Irish Parliamentary Party got into power, 1870 something or other, and nothing happened for 46 years or thereabouts until Easter Rising. Not that I'm suggesting anything like that, but nevertheless, it's very easy. You can see how a party can get becalmed and lose its purpose. And that's what's happened here, and we certainly have to do something about it. I agree.
I agree with all of that. Well, our time is almost up, Ian. I'm very grateful to you for joining us tonight. Are there any last comments you would like to make before we bring things to a close?
Well, just that those of you who are watching this, there's still time to enroll as delegates at the in the convention, and you have to hurry a bit because we've had quite a lot of interest, and we're well over 3/4 full. And so, if you go to the website that's there, independenceforum.scot, and go to National Convention, and you can fill in the form and become a delegate at the conference. As I say, don't waste time on this because spaces are filling up really quite quickly.
There you are, folks. Move fast if you want to get a place at the conference. Well, thank you again. Really appreciate it, Ian. And let me just close by thanking Ian again, and also pointing out that next week we have John Proctor, perhaps plus a colleague from Energy Scotland. So that'll be another stimulating discussion. So see you all next week, 7 o'clock on Wednesday. In the meantime, look after each other, stay safe, and take care. Good night, all.
Good night.